Whether it's a meteoroid, nuclear war, or a zombie plague, the possibilities of humans going to hell are versatile and often quite spectacular. And it can be easy to miss out that if everything goes wrong, the climate catastrophe can lead to a post-apocalyptic scenario as well.
As she is taken by the water.
This is the scenario chosen by developer Monarch for their survival city builder Floodland, which had been released in November 2022. Here we got to build a new civilization from the ground up, completely without guts and explosions. Whether or not the game can still be interesting, we are going to explore in this review. Regarding the story, there is actually more to talk about than you might guess when you think about a survival city builder. As mentioned, Floodland takes place after the climate catastrophe, which in this scenario received an additional push from another direction, though it's initially a bit unclear what this push could have been. It's referred to as the event, and while progressing within the game we will find more and more old newspaper articles which help us to reconstruct what really happened back then. In any case, it appears like the world like we know it was completely devoured by the flood. How countries like Switzerland fit into that picture, I don't know. We choose 1 out of 4 clans to start with and set off to rebuild the world. But more specifically, we also want to get a special power plant up and running again. And this happens within the framework of an overarching story, through which we are always given a clear next goal. Initially, this takes the function of a tutorial and gives us the first goals: setting up a camp, building shelters and exploring the area. So at the beginning, we have a lot of rather quick steps in this quest which only get longer and start to take multiple hours once you found this power plant. In addition, there are also small story events about once or twice per hour in the game, where we have to make decisions which in turn lead to follow-up events. At least until we made it halfway through the game. After that, very little happens in this regard. While the mechanics are still the main element of the game, this focus on the story is one more thing which points towards this game being made for just one single playthrough. While you can make other decisions in these small story events, and you can also go different routes regarding the social policies you choose to introduce, these will not have a big impact in regards of gameplay. Actually, also the 3 clans which you did not choose to take at the start of the game will join you anyways later on. And while the map you play on does have random elements, these will not have much influence on the decisions you make. While I do like the story aspects, the density of events and quest progress decreases greatly during the second half of the game, so you can't really say that it actually carried the game. Apart from that, I think the mechanics are mostly what you would expect from a survival city builder, although the term survival is certainly debatable, but I will get back to that a little bit later. We are starting out with few resources and only a couple of building plans, and have to build our new settlement one step at a time. We do have food and water from the very start, but they can only be collected in an extremely inefficient way, meaning you only have very few survivors left which can be assigned to other tasks, which will actually help growing the settlement. For that, you need to gather the first 2 resources needed for constructing new buildings: wood and, which is quite cool, plastic waste. The piles of plastic trash washed up on the beach are considered as a renewable resource here, collected via a designated survivor in a collector's hut. The plastic is then picked up by the workers of the closest storage and can be used for the construction of buildings. But these workers assigned to the storage are also responsible for other jobs. They actually bring the materials for processing buildings, such like sawmills, which make boards out of the raw wood. And these workers are also doing nearby exploration and collection tasks by pointing them to a certain location or building. While you can assign where the individual, but otherwise nameless and exchangeable characters have to work, you can't control them directly or decide what their workday looks like when they are going to eat or sleep, or with which priority storage workers are working on their tasks. While you can set priorities within the different categories, you can't weight the categories against each other. And so they will happily plunder a building or build some roads while they are starving to death, as they don't put any priority on collecting the food from the cooking hut. And while the output of the cook is maxed out, the cook will also stop cooking, making the situation even worse. Quite annoying. Besides of the storage and the buildings for processing, there are also buildings where survivors can spend their free time and buildings to research new tech. These recreational buildings actually serve multiple purposes. The first one being that the survivors can actually chill, though I didn't really notice any impact of that in the game. The second purpose is to improve the relations between the different clans towards each other. I mentioned that later on additional clans will join the settlement, and generally all the clans hate each other. If they have to work together, then their relations towards each other go down and their anger increases. But if you offer buildings for common use of their leisure time, these relations can improve. But while that sounds okay on paper, it doesn't feel great in the game, as it's not super transparent and hard to calculate with. And that's why I spread the clans to individual islands called districts in the game. I guess that doesn't exactly send the best message, but in terms of game mechanics it seems to clearly be the preferable solution. And that also makes it much easier to plan with these recreational buildings, as survivors from the Ulrich clan hate having art galleries in their neighborhood. The third purpose of these buildings is that they also generate influence points which you can use to enact new social policies. There's a whole range of branched out policies you can decide between, but the most important and useful ones are checked off after just a short time. And then you start choosing something which at least brings some net positive effect. I guess the idea is that by making these decisions you also decide on what kind of society you want to build, and accordingly each clan got its own opinion about each new law. But with some laws like the ban of meat, you kind of wonder whether inhabitants of this post-apocalyptic world don't have more important things to worry about than to bother to implement such laws. It's the other way around with the marriage for everyone. I mean, in such a world, nobody should care about who is together with whom. And I kind of doubt that it's about tax advantages. I mean, I get the idea, but it seems partially cringy and partially it actually sends a questionable message. Like one law which gives one single clan privileges over everyone else, which actually has a very positive effect on the settlements as a whole. Buildings for research are working in a different way, and much like buildings for processing, they can be used in different modes. In this case, one mode can be used for education, which is used to give all members of one specific clan a higher focus or discipline, which is a skill used to get certain work done more efficiently. Another mode can be used to do classic research. The research points can then be invested into technologies in the research tree. Among these are new buildings, building improvements, and a couple of things which will help to explore the map and to plunder ruins. The research menu, similarly as the construction menu, is split up into different categories, which are extremely unintuitive, so that you're likely going to check out 2 or 3 menus each time you're looking for a specific technology or building. And so you build the settlement and expand it during the course of the game. The biggest problem in the beginning will be the lack of food, especially buildings like the clam farm are so inefficient that people who work there for collecting food hardly survive themselves with that food they collect. So it can make sense to explore a bit more aggressively and to stay alive by food you find that way. It's actually quite hard to estimate the food consumption correctly, as the population needs more than what is needed for survival, so it can take quite some time until you actually see that some reserves are starting to materialize. Similar as with other survival city builders, there is hardly any challenge or important decisions to make once you got everything running. There are no military conflicts or events which really challenge you, and so there isn't really much of any survival aspects in the game. Besides of that, you can also freely save at any time, and if you make a bad decision, you can just reload. Like mentioned in the beginning, you do have a story aspect, but that's mostly limited to the start of the game. After about half of the playthrough, the game becomes mostly just routine. You're exploring new locations, collecting resources, building new storages and food, inviting new people in, and explore new locations again. Research and especially social politics quickly lose their relevance, especially if you just put the individual clans on separate islands as I did. But the thought of having to deal with conflicts resulting from clan squabbles make me shudder as well. Also thanks to the bad overview you got managing all that. And with that, we are getting to my main point of criticism of the game: the interface. I guess by now it already shown through that there are issues with the interface at every corner. And I'm not just talking about things like this and that being a bit cumbersome to look up, but especially that essential information is often withheld from the player, making it nearly impossible to make good decisions. If I talked about all the issues I encountered, this review would take forever. So instead I will just show you a list of the problems I found, and we'll talk about a few of the most important or most representative ones. Now and then the survivors will approach you and demand to introduce a specific social policy. The problem? At that point you have no information regarding that policy. You don't know if that policy actually excludes introducing another policy. You don't know what will happen if you deny or fail to implement it. You don't know where it's in the policy tree and how accessible it is. How many influence points it's going to cost. How much time you got to implement it. And with that you also have no idea whether it's actually possible to implement the policy within the unknown time frame. So you have to make a decision without having any basis for it whatsoever. There's a similar problem when a new clan wants to join the settlement. You will get the logo and the description, but you have to conclude yourself where they stand in regards to their social alignment. And of course it's impossible to know which buildings they despise. By the way, regarding these buildings, it's also not apparent in the social tree that some of these recreative building unlocks actually exclude each other. In difference to other either-or policy decisions, it's not listed in their description, and the little symbol next to it doesn't have a tooltip. The overview is quite terrible almost everywhere, but it is especially bad in the construction and planning of roads. While the survivors don't need roads to reach a building, roads will improve their walking speed by quite a bit. But there's no interface which shows you where you already got roads. And as roads in this game are more like dirt tracks, which are hardly distinguishable from the rest of the environment, building a road later on becomes a torture. But if you build the roads beforehand, it's getting problematic as well. When you place the building and it shows you that some tiles are blocked, you won't see whether this is some random obstacle or a road you built in the past. So especially the planning of your city easily becomes an ordeal, which, as you might guess, isn't exactly great to have in a city builder. If you weren't able to pause the game as much as you wanted, this alone would already be a death sentence for the game. Regarding the graphics, I would make a distinction between the actual 3D graphics of the game environment and the 2D graphics for portraits, loading screens and so on. These 2D graphics got a very unique art style with realistic shapes but quite an abstract choice of colors, which also looks a bit like it was drawn with a real brush. Personally, I like these graphics, but I guess that this style is certainly something a bit more polarizing than your average art. The 3D environment is possibly somewhat based on this, but unfortunately only the somewhat coarse remains here, which could ultimately also be seen as muddy. The soundtrack is really well done and mixes sounds from a Wild West movie and movies like Blade Runner, which provides a fitting atmosphere to the game. And then we get to the bugs. And there are smaller bugs like demolishing a building and then instantly getting the message that looting the building has been completed, but also bigger ones which might stop the whole game from being playable. One patch was actually making save games unusable. Another one caused the workers in expeditions to not do their jobs anymore. At the time I'm releasing this review, these bigger bugs have been fixed, but considering that they were introduced via patches, I can't quite give you a good estimate on the state of the game at the time you are watching this. Definitely not a great situation. And unfortunately, my conclusion for the game isn't that far away from that. The scenario is definitely something different and interesting, and the game has its own style in terms of presentation. I don't think the approach of focusing more on the story is bad in itself, but then the game has to be set up in a way that the story stays interesting for a whole playthrough. In Floodland, the story only really matters for the first half of the game, and then the focus is almost completely reduced to the mechanics, which however have also lost in importance at that point. Once the food problem is solved, there are no challenges anymore. Regarding technology and social policies, you quickly reach a point where you got everything which really makes a difference. So for the second half of the playthrough, which will take about 20 to 35 hours in total, the only thing left is the routine task of building cities, which due to the catastrophic interface isn't pleasant to do. Now, in theory, you can fix many of the flaws with patches, but without changing the balance and mechanics or implementing additional story elements for the second half of the game, I don't really see how the game can stay interesting. And so, I can't give the game more than a thumbs halfway down. And at the price of 30 euros, it's also hard to give a limited recommendation for certain types of gamers. What might be more worthwhile is to get the really good soundtrack for 8 euros. And if you think watching this review was worthwhile for you, then feel free to leave a thumbs up or a subscription. I do have a full let's play of the game, but that one is over at my German channel in case you are interested and understand the language. I also got a webpage over at ndnw.net which contains a list of all the games I played so far. So much for the excursion into the climate post-apocalypse. I say goodbye and will now get back to more pleasant things, like fighting for your life in a good old zombie apocalypse.